Hi everybody, it's Gordon here today talking to you about AQA GCSE English language, specifically how your wider reading can inform and improve your own writing. Now, what does that mean? Well, your own writing is going to take place in two sections of the GCSE English language paper. First of all, on paper 1, section B, it's going to be a piece of creative writing, be it narrative or descriptive writing. And on paper 2, it's going to be the section B, non-fiction writing, being that might be a letter, an essay, a leaflet, an article, or even a speech that you're required to produce. Okay, so how is it that your wider reading, fiction, be that novels, short stories, or whatever, is going to inform and improve your writing in these particular sections on the exam paper? Start with creative writing. Plots, that's the first thing we need to think about. You will have encountered through your wider reading many different types of plots. Probably more than you're aware of, a lot of it sort of being absorbed almost subconsciously. And I think you should acknowledge that in the first instance, because you need to be able to perhaps draw deeply on some of those plot lines that you will be aware of from your own reading in the course of over the course of time, specifically in the last year or two of your exam course. What happens, when and how, and to whom. Secondly, you need to think about the structure and the structures that you have become familiar with from your wider reading. Now, obviously, this is all to do with the organisation of your ideas, the paragraphing that you're going to have to put in place, and how you shape the whole series of events in your particular story, and even in your your descriptive writing too. How can you piece that all together in a way that's going to be most interesting, most engaging, and most impactful for your reader, in this case, the examiner. Thirdly, specifically when you're dealing with narrative writing, you're obviously going to need to have some characters in your story. You will have encountered numerous characters again in the course of your wider reading, and you need to think about how those characters have been presented. How are they introduced, first of all, in a story? What does the writer tell us about them? How are they described? What are the giveaways that help us understand them as characters, perhaps in terms of their appearance, in terms of the detail that the writer chooses to give us? So you will be able to again draw down on this in the course of your understanding from your wider reading, and feed into and build into your own writing, your own stories. Settings too, clearly important. Where is this story set? Is it set in a forest? Is it set on a beach? Is it set in in an urban setting? All these sorts of things. It could be on a bus ride home, perhaps, from school. You've got 1,000,001 different settings that you could perhaps draw on. But critically, if you think back to the short stories, the fiction that you've encountered, that you've read carefully with your teacher and independently, you will be able to sort of identify and pinpoint many different settings that those writers have chosen to use. Use of dialogue, particularly in stories, obviously, in narrative writing, writers will typically deploy dialogue between characters to literally help bring the story alive. Now, you need to be looking at or thinking about the short stories and novels that you've read. How does the writer use that dialogue? Perhaps to show the difference between two different characters. One might be rather aggressive, the other a little bit more submissive. One might be a little aggressive, trying to be a little bit over persuasive. The other one might be a slightly more timid character. How does this come through in the dialogue used? Think about that, and think about your own choices when it comes to producing your own pieces of dialogue. How is it set out, by the way? How much are you going to use in your piece of writing on paper 1, section B? Again, think and watch carefully how these professional writers are actually doing this in the novels and short stories. Oftentimes, yes, there's dialogue, but it's perhaps not nearly as much as you think it might be. And it is very easy, of course, to let dialogue run away with you before you know what's happening. You've written a whole page of it. You don't necessarily want to do that, obviously. Think too about your descriptive content. what are those writers that you've been reading in your wider reading? What is it in terms of descriptive content that they offer you? Is it something to do with the weather, perhaps? Is it something to do with the atmosphere and the mood? Is it, does that atmosphere and mood change? You've got a million and one things to be alert to as you read through, these different sets of these different books that constitute wider reading. I think, it is often worth reflecting on your own reading, and I'll share with you briefly just, a handful of examples at this point. As a very young child, there was a book called The King Who Learned to Smile. Very simple story, really. I enjoyed reading it for myself, or I often, would enjoy people reading it to me. Now, The King Who Learned to Smile is about a young king who has got pretty well everything. Almost like a King Midas, really. A lot of things in his life are physically made of gold. And yet, this young king cannot smile. That's the premise of the story. So the king is the protagonist and he cannot smile, while all around him, his advisors, the wise men, etc., they're all trying in their various ways to come up with schemes and ruses to help him smile. And that's the challenge. And by the end of the story, sure enough, this young king does learn to smile. And it's as a result of a very simple little strategy that they put into place. So that king has undergone change in the course of that story, and any story typically will involve change for the main character, and you do need to think through that quite carefully. Second story that I'd perhaps refer you to, you may have come across, is The Hobbit. Obviously linked to the Lord of the Rings stories as well, but right at the start of The Hobbit, you have this strange little character called Bilbo Baggins living in Bag End. And Bilbo Baggins is leading a very comfortable life, quite happy where he is, until, of course, the wizard Gandalf turns up and challenges him to set off on this journey with him and his gang of fellow elves. Now, Bilbo Baggins at the outset is absolutely terrified at the prospect of leaving his safe, comfortable dwelling. And yet that's what he's being encouraged to do. And sure enough, he sets off on this journey. He encounters Gollum, that rather unpleasant character, and he takes part in battles and so forth, and ultimately overcomes his fears, overcomes, these various obstacles in his way. We could go on and on here. But typically, by the time he returns to his home, he too is very much a changed character. He's undergone that change, as did the king in that initial story. So we've got some shape there in terms of the storyline, the plot, and in terms of the characters and their development. If you wanted to look at dialogue and you were thinking about The Hobbit, you could obviously think through how that dialogue works between Gollum and Bilbo Baggins at some point. Another novel, of course, that we might be familiar with is Charles Dickens' novel Oliver Twist. Let's think about the nature of the changes and the obstacles that character goes through. It's a long novel, obviously, and you've only got a short amount of time in your essay, in your piece of narrative writing. So we're not trying to write anything of that length, but do think about the settings there, the hurdles that Oliver Twist has to overcome, and the other characters that he encounters, and some of the bleak, rather dark, rather threatening settings that he encounters. We could also, as I say, even quickly switch out of reading as such and briefly think about plot lines in famous films, like, for example, E.T., the extraterrestrial. Look at the hurdles that he overcomes, the alien, the extraterrestrial landing in an alien environment, befriended by the young character, threatened by all the medics and scientists, and threatened by this chase at the end. Will he or won't he make it to the spaceship and be rescued by his compatriots? Lots of things happening in those short, different stories there. Okay, you will be able to think of many different stories, I'm sure, and I think you in the first instance you might want to just stop and take a pause at this point in the video, perhaps pause it after I've finished giving you these details. Think about your GCSE English anthology. Think about 2 or 3 of the short stories. Now, the one I'm familiar with, you may be familiar with too, contains a story called Chemistry by Graham Swift, or Your Shoes by Michelle Roberts, or even Flight by Doris Lessing. Now, if you take a pause for a moment here, quickly jot down, as far as you're able to remember, what the plot is, A to B, what actually happens in those various short stories. What's the time frame for the narrative? Does it take place over a day? Does it take place, longer than that? Just a very condensed space of time, indeed, in the story. Who's the main character? What happens to them? Who do they engage in dialogue with? What's the setting? All these sorts of things that we've already been talking about. So take a pause for a moment, and then you can obviously start the video any time. But just jot down some thoughts about that now. Okay, moving on. How does this then apply specifically to non-fiction writing? How can you draw on your wider reading to inform and improve your non-fiction writing? Okay, it's a very different ball game, obviously, non-fiction writing. In a way, you can actually, funnily enough, draw still on some of those stories that we've been talking about already, because, in some ways, a piece of non-fiction writing relies for its success on your ability to engage with your reader, the examiner. You want to interest him or her. You want to draw them into your argument, your ideas in that piece of non-fiction writing. So sometimes, you might want to just pepper it with a little anecdote to bring it alive a little bit. But let's backtrack a moment here with non-fiction writing. It is critically about the structure of your piece of non-fiction writing, be it, let's remind ourselves, a letter, a leaflet, article, essay, or a speech, and how you critically organise the information and ideas that you've got into that structure. Okay, now it's going to be obviously all about paragraphing here, but it's all about, the logical sequencing of your ideas. You're not necessarily going to be working to those sorts of analytical ideas or detailed facts and figures in your creative writing. That's not the requirement there. But here you have to, in the first instance, collate quite a lot of ideas and information and think carefully about how you structure them. If you want to take a look over this channel of mine, the YouTube channel, you will see another video that's very popular on here, which is all about how you can write a discursive essay. And critically, it's all about how you pull together those ideas and how you shape and structure them. Secondly, you need to think about when you've been doing your wider reading, so what sort of language features have you come across? What sort of things have worked for those other writers, be it in their blogs, be it in newspaper articles, be it in letters that you've encountered, etc. Well, it might be things such as repetition, repetition of a phrase, repetition of an idea, repetition of an argument. It might be the rule of 3, which you're probably familiar with, or the use of plenty of facts and figures, because they can support and back up your line of thinking in your piece. I've already mentioned perhaps the use of anecdotes that can help too. It might be the idea of having a particularly strong opening that challenges the reader, or perhaps the audience even, as we might see the reader when it comes to non-fiction writing. And also, of course, the careful and considered use of emotive language, because that too is going to help you make an impact on your reader with your non-fiction writing. Think too about the register of the whole piece that you're writing. Think about your choice of words, phrases, and sentence structures that together create the register in your piece of non-fiction writing. So look back perhaps at a newspaper article. How did that writer there what sort of words were they choosing? What sort of phrases and what sort of sentence structures? Probably rather more limited sentences than you might come across perhaps in your creative writing. But who knows? Have a look, think about what it is that they're actually able to do. And your job is to use that as a model, really, to help improve and inform your own writing. So as I say, it's things like blogs, blog posts, it's emails you might even look at, lengthy emails. newspaper articles, all those sorts of things, and even, as I mentioned before, fiction as well. Magazines clearly play a part there. You might want to have a look at actual leaflets. You can find many around. And of course, these days, big advantage is that you've got lots of website content to access as well. So plenty of things there that you can, plenty of wider reading that you can take part, that you can do either in class with your English teacher or under their guidance and with their recommendations for your own reading out of class. So that's really what you're going to be doing when you come to this, trying to, as I say, as AQA are asking you to do, and that is to use your wider reading to help inform and improve. So you're looking at these, essentially they're models. You will have absorbed a lot subconsciously, but you should also make a conscious effort to look at the sorts of features, the sort of ways they're using language, the way they're structuring things, the way they're handling their ideas to make their writing effective and bring that over into your writing. Okay, if you want some further ideas, you can look at 2 books that I've got out, both on Amazon, and they're by myself, Gordon Michael Sutton. The first book is called You Write It, and that's creative writing for GCSE English. And the second one is called You Write It, NonFiction Writing for GCSE English. They're both available on Amazon, and as I say, by myself, Gordon Michael Sutton. Do think about subscribing to the channel. I hope you found it useful. And there's also Twitter available as well. You can follow us there too. Okay, take care everybody, and I'll see you soon. Bye for now.